Hello, everybody. Today we are wrapping up this PowerPoint on key concepts. We're covering ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. And so all of this is going to be building on the things we have done so far. And remember, as I said in a previous class, these terms mean something distinct to anthropologists compared to what they mean in common usage in pop culture. In particular, ethnocentrism and cultural relativism are not seen as morally weighted for an anthropologist. It is about an analytical strategy. It's a strategy for thinking about human variation. And it's a framework that helps us think about what makes rigorous and strong analysis if our goal is to understand that human difference. But for an anthropologist, we really are thinking about ethnocentrism and cultural relativism as a cognitive and intellectual strategy, not as anything, not as a moral statement about good or bad people. It just does not boil down to good or bad people for us. So last class, we went over several working definitions of culture, as well as some foundations of sociolinguistic analysis that helps us think about symbols and so last class, we went over several working definitions of culture, as well as some foundations of linguistic analysis that help us think about symbolic systems and the role that symbolic systems play in human beings' lives. And so some working definitions of culture include the sum total of learned behaviors and beliefs, a system of symbols, and everything you consider normal and natural. Now, the concepts of ethnocentrism and cultural relativism build on that foundation by providing us a sort of set of guideposts, a direction, a path to follow for how to think about human variation if our goal is to understand cultural difference. Now, one quick pro tip before I move on. This is something I brought up in previous classes, but now is when I'm going to start coming back and hitting it harder. As a professional anthropologist, I actually don't tend to use culture as a noun. Because when you start using culture as a noun, you end up getting in this kind of blocky way of thinking where it's either their culture or our culture, and we think about culture as having these kinds of rigid boundaries or borders between them in a way that actually makes it harder to understand the reality of what is happening, which is just human beings interacting with each other, often across these boundaries that we imagine between cultures. So this is the same kind of idea as what we talked about with Audre Lorde and James Baldwin, thinking about culture as consisting of lots of differences, a system of differences, really, versus the Narsarima article, which imagines culture as a set of shared patterns, shared behaviors, shared beliefs, shared practices. So I tend to use culture as an adjective because that gets us out of this trap. So instead of saying Western culture, Hawaiian culture, I would talk about things like cultural beliefs, cultural practices, cultural values. Because when we talk about those things, it's not going to be your culture versus my culture. It's just, it gives us a little bit more fine-grained vision into what's happening. Because you could be interacting with somebody and developing beliefs, new beliefs through a conversation with them, and they might be on the other side of the world. And that's still a cultural process. That's still a cultural practice. It's a cultural belief. And it also means you don't have to have you don't have to do the same practices. You can interact with people with different cultural practices, even in one interaction. So it just gives us a little more precision in how we think about culture. So early on in the class, at this point, it's hard for me to not use culture as a noun when I'm trying to explain basic anthropological concepts, uh, like the concept of culture itself. But as we go into the class further and further in the semester, you will see me using culture as a noun less and less. And I encourage you all to do the same thing. See if you can strike culture as a noun from your vocabulary and see what kind of language takes shape to fill that gap, because I think that might get y'all going a little deeper. Okay, so finally, we're at the concept, ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism and cultural relativism are opposites. Ethnocentrism refers to evaluating other people's culture based on the standards of your own. Now, you might notice I just use culture as a noun. Again, it's very hard to explain these concepts without doing that, but I will shift away from that later on in the semester. So if ethnocentrism is evaluating other people's cultures based on the standards of your own, it's basically saying, oh, I believe that my own culture is natural and normal, and I take it for granted. And so I evaluate everyone else based on my own standards. That's ethnocentrism. We see ethnocentrism really, really well in the Shakespeare and the Bush article. That is a really good example of this because we see it from both Laura Bohannon and Tilv Elders. So Laura Bohannon enters into this conversation, the anthropologist enters into this interaction thinking, oh, I have Hamlet, I know what Hamlet means, I know what it's about, I find this to be important art, an important part of the human experience. Now, that's maybe an older idea. Many of y'all probably have not read Shakespeare or Hamlet, but this was certainly a big idea in the 60s. When Laura Bohannon was writing. And it's a useful kind of example to think through. So Laura Bohannon has this interaction, and Tiv Elders say, oh no, you must be mistaken because that doesn't make any sense. Ghosts, that's not a concept that exists in Tiv worldviews. You can't even say, I don't believe in ghosts, because that presumes a shared concept of a ghost in the first place, and that concept just does not exist. So, okay, if it's not a ghost, which is something Laura Bohannon has to explain because it's a new concept, a different concept, maybe we can think about it as an omen or a witch. Or, no, it's actually totally proper for Hamlet's mom to remarry very quickly because, after all, you need some help around the house. You need someone to work in the fields, and it's not feasible to do that on your own as one person. You need a family. And an uncle's a good person. I'm sorry, the dead husband's brother is a good person to marry because he's a known factor. He's safe. And so, in this interpretation, Hamlet is acting wrong. He is breaking the social norms. He is acting inappropriately. Versus Laura Bohannon, who views Hamlet as the hero of the story. So Tiv Elders are evaluating the story of Shakespeare based on their own cultural standards. They are imposing their standards on that text. That is ethnocentric. Meanwhile, Laurel Bohannon is saying, the anthropologist is saying, oh, no, that's not what this story is about. You misunderstand. And she is imposing her standards, and she's getting more and more frustrated, imposing her standards to try to, quote unquote, correct Tiv Elders. So she is also acting in an ethnocentric way. She's imposing her own cultural standards on Shakespeare as a text, as well as how she's interacting with Tiv Elders and what they should be getting out of it. Now, what she's doing in this article is a little subtle as an author, like on the level of how she writes. Part of what she does is she writes herself as a character in the article. And that gives her, it's a literary technique. It does a couple different things. You'll remember I told you that all perspectives have politics. We all bring our perspective into our research. Writing yourself as a character is something anthropologists often do to kind of account for that. But it also lets her do this really interesting literary technique as an author, which is she presents her own character as a dumbass. And we learn through her mistakes and her misunderstandings. It's a really good style of writing for dramatizing cultural difference. It's something I do in my own writing. I tend to represent myself as a dumbass because it dramatizes your own ethnocentrism to help the reader see it, see these assumptions that they might share. So basically, when we talk about ethnocentrism, you're putting your own cultural assumptions at the center of your analysis. The root words are ethnos, which comes from the word, a Greek word meaning a culture or a people with certain customs, and centrism, to put at the center. You're putting your own culture and customs at the center. Now, it's not necessarily a moral problem, right? I don't think TIV elders are bad for being ethnocentric. I don't even think Laura Bohannon is bad for being ethnocentric. I would say we are all ethnocentric, and we all have that in us, and part of the process is to figure out how to identify our own ethnocentrism and unlearn it. So, again, it's not that TIV elders are bad. They're not morally wrong here. However, their approach, if their goal was to understand European or American culture or European or American understandings of Hamlet, an ethnocentric approach isn't going to get them very far because all it's telling them is what is their own cultural perspective, right? Same with Laura Bohannon. When she adopts an ethnocentric perspective, she's not really able to understand um, TIV elders' perspectives in the same way, right? She can only really impose her own perspective, and that's the limit of what she's able to understand. So if your goal is to understand difference, then ethnocentrism is a problem because it gets in the way of that understanding. Now, for me as an anthropologist, that's an intellectual problem, not a moral one. It assumes, for example, that our goal is to understand human difference, which it may not be. I'll get more into that later. Another great example of ethnocentrism comes from Papineau's article, Ideal. Remember how she talks about this experience she has where she says, oh, she starts learning how to see fat as beautiful. She's even able to gain some weight herself. However, she says she's not able to gain enough weight. I'm sorry, she's not able to gain as much weight as the other women she's working with and still see herself as beautiful. She can't make her body look like that and still consider herself beautiful. It messes with her self-esteem. Now, the person who originally owned this book that I bought used has this kind of note in the sideline, what a bitch, or something like that, like, whatever. It's kind of funny. I mean, I don't tend to use that word in that context, but, you know, anyway, the point is, like, that student, I really disagree with that perspective, right? That student is leveraging a moral judgment. Oh, look, here's the anthropologist failing to get past their own ethnocentrism. But my response as an anthropologist is, of course. Of course we all have ethnocentric perspectives. And if we can see it, even if we can't totally dismantle it, that's good. Because it gives us important information. When we are able to identify our own ethnocentrism, we first of all are learning about our own culture, we're learning about our own beliefs and our own values, and we're learning about, and so in this case with Papineau saying, I can't gain that kind of weight and see myself as beautiful, part of what we're learning is how deeply ingrained these beauty standards are in American culture. They are so ingrained that she can cognitively understand Arab beauty standards in Nigeria. She can even start to see those women as beautiful in their fatness, but she cannot internalize that and apply it to her own body. That is a deep level of cultural force, right? These symbolic systems, what does fatness mean, have a deep level of force in our lives and even our ability to understand our own bodies. So, again, this is not a moral problem. It is an intellectual one. This is Papineau's limit. This is as far as she's able to go. And the limit itself tells us something about our own culture. And I think it's also just useful to keep in mind, right? Like, if your goal is to not be ethnocentric, and that's what it means to be a good person, you're never going to be a good person. We are all ethnocentric, and we can identify it. We can start unlearning it. Sometimes we can unlearn it better than others, but it takes time, it takes work, and it's actually worth it even just to identify your own ethnocentrism, even if you can't do that right away. So cultural relativism is the opposite of ethnocentrism. Cultural relativism means instead of approaching a different culture and evaluating it based on your own standards, what you're doing is you're trying to understand what other people are doing based on their own perspective, their own standards. You're asking, how does this thing that this person is doing that I fundamentally don't understand and find surprising, how does that make sense to them? Why does this seem like a good idea to them? How does it make sense in the larger context that they're operating within? And how does it make sense in the context of their perspective, the perspective they have on the world from their own place within it? So this is really the cornerstone of modern anthropological analysis, right? If your goal is to understand other people's perspectives, you have to be able to do this. If your goal is to understand cultural variation, you have to be able to do this. You have to be able to say, okay, I see that I have my own ethnocentric ideas about what fatness means, for example, but I can put that aside to understand someone else. The way we talk about this in anthropology is it requires a temporary suspension of judgment. You want to remove the judgmental language, the language that evaluates these kinds of practices. Are they good or are they bad? If you're asking, is this good or bad? You're not going to be able to understand it on a culturally relative level. Because if your question is this good or bad? You are, by definition, imposing your own values. Now, I don't think that's an inherently bad thing to do. However, again, if your goal is to understand someone else's perspective, it's not going to get you super far. So you have to be thinking, what are the standards and values of this other culture, of this other person, which may not be the same as mine. You have to start to see both sides, in the sense of you have to understand your perspective better in order to also understand someone else's perspective. Both of those things, that understanding of both, that difference itself is part of the process, right? You understand yourself better as you understand other people better. Because you start seeing the things that you yourself were taking for granted, that you treated as normal and as natural. So part of this temporary suspension of judgment means that you are, as I said, you're trying to remove kind of judgmental language or judgmental perspectives because your goal is really just to understand at that point. Now, it is temporary. I'm not saying you have to keep that level of judgment suspended eternally, right? That's a little going beyond, I think, what is reasonable for a human being. But it's a strategy. You have to put aside your own perspective, at least for a little bit, to understand somebody else. So a good example of this can come out of something like you can see this in Death Without Weeping by Nancy Shepherd Hughes, where she's engaging with really just astronomical rates of infant mortality in a shanty town in Brazil. Her first reaction, I'm sorry, let me go back. One of the phenomenon she finds is that mothers will actually let their children die. They will stop feeding certain children if they consider that child to be not to be fighting for its own life. And from her perspective, she just thinks this is horrible, right? And it's easy when you see that kind of thing to think, wow, these are terrible mothers who are neglecting their children and letting these infants die. That's horrible, right? It's painful. And I'm sure many of y'all, when you read this, you felt that horror, that pain on a visceral level. That is an ethnocentric perspective, right? I'm not saying it's okay to let children die. This is not about a moral statement. However, it is an application of our own, or Nancy Shepherd Hughes' own, cultural values. And that means we can't really understand what's going on for these women. Now, the first pitfall that students will often have in an intro level course is they try to be culturally relative, but it's in a very kind of narrow, shallow way where you might say, oh, the mothers just don't really value human life. Like, that must be the cultural difference. They clearly don't value human life well, whereas our culture does. That's really debatable about American culture. I would argue that if American culture really valued human life, we would do things a lot differently, like with the Flint water crisis or climate change or any number of other things. But that's neither, that's neither here nor there. Um, Whenever you evaluate another person or another culture on the basis of they don't value this or they don't do this, that's an implicit value judgment. That's an implicit ethnocentric perspective because you're defining them and their perspective as the absence of something you have. That means you're understanding them on your terms, not theirs. So Nancy Shepherd Hughes has to learn how to go deeper. And as she tries to understand women's perspectives, she starts understanding the problem much more deeply. For these women, um, they are in a really tough situation. They are dealing with crushing poverty in which they actually don't necessarily have enough resources to feed their whole families. And they are making really hard choices about things like, hey, I only have so much food. Do I give that food to an infant who might die anyway and then force my other children to go hungry as a result? Or do I give the food to the children who I know are going to survive? There's many compounding factors, right? There's a larger social context here that shapes what these women think is reasonable and good behavior. And that context is, in large part, the political and economic context. It's a larger social problem that they are trying to navigate. So combined with that kind of core level of poverty, right, we have many other factors, including things like the conditions of domestic labor in which women in this shantytown are providing services for wealthier families. That's where they're getting their income from. But those wealthy families don't want their domestic employees, their maids to or their nurses to be bringing their own children. So that means that the mothers have to, in many cases, right, if they don't have family to lean on, have to leave infants in conditions where they are not able to provide care for the working day, which is very long. There's other conditions like like governmental systems. One issue that she talks about in a different chapter of this larger work is the ways in which the municipal government actually is not keeping very good records of infant mortality. One of the reasons for that is if you are a government, you're a bureaucracy. The way you keep track of death rates is things like you need paperwork. And the form for documenting that somebody dies, in this case an infant dies, requires all this background information, including things like an address. However, if you live in a shanty town, this is an informal housing community. You don't necessarily have an address. So you can't even fill out the form because the way you live is not legible to the government, to the city government. This is actually another great example of ethnocentrism because bureaucracy, one of the limitations that bureaucracies often create in human lives is that they are very ethnocentric systems because they are about developing universal standards that are applied to everyone, that are imposed on everyone. So in this case, the city government says humans should have an address. They should have a home and they should have an address. That's what's considered normal. That's what's considered natural. And if you fall between the cracks, if you don't have that, you can't even be counted by, you're not even able to be seen. Your child's life and death is not even able to be seen by that government. So there's a level of institutional neglect happening here. There are also religious factors, everything from religious sanctions against birth control to religious belief systems that would say, oh, when an infant dies, they're being called back to Jesus. And that some babies, or that some babies don't even want to live, right? That they don't have a desire to live. There are all of these kinds of religious belief systems that make sense of and naturalize infant mortality. They make infant mortality look normal, look natural. That's what I mean by naturalize. So women are in this larger context that is shaped by all of these complicated factors. And it's only when the anthropologist Nancy Shepherd Hughes suspends her own judgment on the mothers that she's able to start going deeper and see this larger context that shapes the mother's actions and the ways in which ultimately mothers are not able to invest emotionally in their children, in their infants. Because if you were to invest emotionally in an infant in a context where infant mortality was this high, you would be so brokenhearted all the time. How could you possibly live like that? And so part of what happens is an adaptive cultural system in which emotional bonds are not formed until once the infant has reached a point where they are more likely to survive through childhood. That is a protective and adaptive mechanism for mothers. It is a dynamic that raises a lot of really interesting questions about what many things we would assume in the United States to be human universals. The idea of motherly love, of motherly attachment, of what motherhood is. Now all of this is kind of thrown into question. Um, I mean, shoot, there are these larger debates about when does a life start? When does an infant have value in the eyes of the government? In terms of abortion, for example, when is it okay to abort? When is it not okay? Maybe okay is not the right word. I don't think anyone says that, but like when is you know what? I will. Fuck it. When is it okay to abort, or is that like morally wrong? And when does life start? Does it start at the moment of conception? Does it start at birth? Does it start other things? That's a cultural set of decisions. And here we see something where just a very different idea about infants. Um, and whether or not, and the interesting here about the abortion debate is that, like, for both Democrats and Republicans, right? I'm not making a partisan argument. Both Democrats and Republicans are debating this within a common set of cultural assumptions about what is natural and what is normal, about motherhood, about conception, about when life starts, right? And what we see in this article is that none of that is actually a human universal. Now, the reason why I say that it is a temporary suspension of judgment, when we do cultural relativism, we want to temporarily suspend our judgment. We see with Nancy Shepherd Hughes that there is a point at the end of the article where she resumes judgment, right? She brings the judgment back in. However, she understands the problem more deeply. So her judgment is now directed at different factors. It's not that the women are bad, it's that there is a larger systematic problem. Things like poverty, right? Things like bureaucratic negligence or bureaucratic invisibility. There are these larger social problems that are bigger than the women. And that is where her judgment enters in after the fact. So we actually can bring in moral judgments, and we often do. I'm a scholar of violence. I study systems of violence. I have moral judgments about them. However, I try to suspend my judgment and when I have a deeper understanding, then my judgments might shift. Now, one really good, yeah, actually, hold on, let me stop there and go to the next slide. So, one common misunderstanding in the United States is people will often conflate cultural relativism and moral relativism. Moral relativism is a philosophical stance that says that because all cultures are different, we cannot make value judgments about different cultures, that every culture is uniquely morally acceptable. It's that all morals are relative. Now, these two things are really different. An anthropologist's perspective on cultural relativism is not the same thing as moral relativism, and that distinction is important. Cultural relativism is a strategy we employ when our goal is to understand a cultural difference or somebody else. It is not about what is right or wrong. A good example of this is if you wanted to do a study of, for example, neo-Nazis. You would have to study them from a perspective that is culturally relative. Because if you want to do an anthropological study, that's the standard. If you don't, all you're going to be able to tell me is your own perspectives, your own preconceptions on neo-Nazis. And what's that going to be, right? That neo-Nazis are bad? But the thing is, I already know neo-Nazis are bad. I don't need a study to tell me that. So that's not actually very interesting information. So the question here, right, is what is the goal? If your goal is to understand difference, cultural relativism matters. However, that may not be your goal. Is it important to understand neo-Nazis' perspectives? That's debatable, right? That is a debate we could have. I kind of believe both things. On the other hand, or similarly with TIV elders, right? TIV elders are being very ethnocentric in their interpretation of Hamlet, but their goal is not to understand cultural difference. Their goals are different. So, with the neo-Nazi example, maybe we say, oh, we want to understand neo-Nazis because how does somebody fall into this belief system? How do they, you're just like, whoa, what is going on here? I want to understand it. If that is what you want, then yes, cultural relativism becomes necessary. You have to do that temporary suspension of judgment. However, there is no point at which you are required to say, because I did this temporary suspension of judgment, I think being a neo-Nazi is okay, like that's acceptable. That is not what cultural relativism is, right? Like, it's a temporary suspension of judgment. You can try to understand neo-Nazis on their own terms without saying being a neo-Nazi is morally fine. Those two things can totally coexist. So, cultural relativism is not the same thing as moral relativism, and that is an important distinction. Cultural relativism can change your perspective, it can change your moral value judgments. It's a process that can help you understand more deeply, and you might shift your moral judgments from a position of understanding more deeply. It may not. For example, if I studied neo-Nazis, there would not really be a point at which I would have shifted my fundamental belief that being a Nazi is not okay. And, but you do have to understand that when you impose those moral judgments, that is, it is ethnocentric. And again, I don't think that's bad. I don't think that's an inherently morally bad thing. Whenever it's just worth recognizing, right? When we say something is bad, when we say something is a bad thing, which I do, right? In this class, I routinely make judgments about systems of violence. That is not a culturally relative argument. That is a argument. That's a moral. It's a different kind of argument, right? So it's important to be able to separate these two things. And of course, cultural relativism does raise a lot of complicated questions about morality, right? If culture is relative, and that includes value systems, then how do we understand? Like, it does kind of raise questions about how do we understand larger morality? Is that also relative? But that is a complicated philosophical conversation. That's a set of questions that you can work through, that you can think through on your own, and I would encourage you to. It's fascinating stuff, right? It's a fascinating set of contradictions and questions, but it's a set of questions, it's not an answer. So cultural relativism is not the same thing as moral relativism. Okay, so here's the discussion element to this class. If you go into Oaks under the material for this week, I have created a discussion forum, which includes you can create new threads, you can respond to your peers. So what I want you to do is I want you to post one thing in response, either in response to one of these three questions that I've posed, or if there's something else you really want to talk about, go for it. That's always great. If there's something that you want to talk about that I haven't thought to ask, that's always wonderful. And then post at least one response to a classmate's comment. So you need to both post your own comment and respond to a classmate's. All right, and I hope y'all have a lovely weekend, and I will see y'all on Monday.